Well, what a crowd. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Maynard. I'm Director of Programs here at the Newseum. Welcome to the Night TV studio. This is our signature program called Inside Media. We have it almost every weekend. We're going to have questions from the audience too, so I'm going to get the conversation started, but we hope to hear from you. And it's been quite a week, hasn't it? Donald J. Trump has been elected the 45th President of the United States, and one of the biggest political upsets in American politics that hardly anyone could have predicted. This week we've seen Mr. Trump visit the White House and Capitol Hill as the transition process begins. And yes, he's back on Twitter, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. Today we are so pleased to be joined by Washington Post media columnist Margaret Sullivan, who will help us put this whole election season into perspective. We'll discuss media coverage of the campaign, but look ahead also to what a Trump administration means for the future of the press and the First Amendment. Of course, the Newseum promotes, explains, and defends the First Amendment, and so it's a big issue for us, of course. Margaret joined the Washington Post as its media columnist earlier this year. Prior to that, she was the New York Times public editor and previously the chief editor of the Buffalo News, her hometown paper where she started as a summer intern. She was a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board from 2011-2012 and was twice elected as a director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where she led the First Amendment Committee. So please welcome Margaret Sullivan. Margaret, first, why don't we talk a little about how you spent election night?
We were just talking about
and how you were processing the results as they came in.
Well, hello everybody, and thanks so much. This is it's great to see everyone, and it's an interesting subject for sure, and one that I've been thinking about a lot for months now, but certainly this past week a lot. So on election night, you know, I like a lot of other people believed that Hillary Clinton would probably win, and I knew I had to write a column for the next day, so I came in at about 5 p.m. and I started working on a column about how the Latino vote might have helped her. And I did some reporting and I wrote a column, but of course it wasn't going to be published till we knew whether this might actually be true. And of course, as the evening went on, it was very apparent that it wasn't playing out that way. And so I quickly, well, actually not so quickly, but I had to switch gears. I did have a deadline for print, and as it became clear, you know, as one state after another that Clinton was expected to get, by some people, went to Trump, I pivoted. I pivoted, yeah. And I wrote a column that basically said the media blew it by not understanding the electorate as well as they should have. And I think also by buying into polls that turned out to not be, in aggregate, good predictors of what was actually happening in our society. Mm-hmm. And then after I wrote that column, I got a kind of a, not an order, but a suggestion from my editors saying, well, what about, you know, so now it's midnight or something. What about how it's going to be between Donald Trump as president and the press? You know, what can we say about that? So I actually wrote a second column, which I ended up filing to be published a little bit later that morning, and this was now in the wee hours, so I couldn't exactly do any reporting because I couldn't call people up at 2 o'clock. So it was kind of off the top of my head, and it ended up being sort of a call to action to journalists to do a better job in every way in this brave new world.
Right. In that first column that you published, you wrote in the first line, quote, "To put it bluntly, the media missed the story." I want you to expand on what you just said. You know, the question is, how did they miss it? Why did everyone in the press, nearly everyone in the press, miss this one?
Right. You know, it's interesting because a lot of news outlets, many, almost all of them, almost all serious news organizations did do stories out of Middle America, out of, you know, what is sometimes, unfortunately, and I think disparagingly called flyover country. You know, reporters did go to Ohio, did go to Michigan, did go to Appalachia, and did good stories. But they were sort of overwhelmed, I think, by, again, the polls, which turned out to be flawed. Although, honestly, if you look at the polls, they all had a margin of error of 2 or 3%, 2 or 3 percentage points, and actually, let's remember, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote. So, but there was a kind of a sense, especially among the big mainstream media outlets, the New York Times and others, that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she was going to win big. Was she going to just win, or would she win in a landslide? This was more of the question. Would she take Florida? The question wasn't, will she take Pennsylvania? Yeah. So I think it was a lack of deep reporting and true understanding of how a lot of the country was feeling so angry and disenfranchised. The dislike of Hillary Clinton, the deep, visceral dislike of this candidate, and Trump's absolute brilliance as a politician.
And how much would you say this election was a straight-out repudiation, rejection of the national media? Print and television.
There's no question that Donald Trump made dislike and disparagement of the media a centerpiece of his campaign. It was part of, going up against the elite institutions was a part, interestingly, a part of Bernie Sanders' appeal, but also a part of Donald Trump's appeal. And certainly the East Coast media, which I guess I have to admit I'm a part of now. I was so long at the Buffalo News, literally 30 years, and it's my hometown. It's a great paper, by the way, that I tend to identify as a Rust Belter and as a, not as an East Coast elite, but, I guess I do work for the Washington Post now. So I went to Georgetown, by the way, so I have a little bit of claim to DC otherwise. Anyway, I think that it was a repudiation. The voters were voting against the status quo, and certainly the media, and certainly the way Donald Trump was portraying the media was a big part of that.
Right. But also, tell us in your view how the media helped to give Donald Trump his chance to go as far as he did. I mean, look at the wall-to-wall coverage of the Trump rallies and whatnot.
Exactly. So especially early on, in the run-up to the primaries, the cable news networks, and CNN, I would say primarily among them, was giving incredible exposure to Donald Trump. Why? I mean, they would film his podium, just waiting for him to come out and do the rally, and then do the whole rally unfiltered, no fact checks, just basically free advertising. Somebody totaled it up and said that up until a certain point of the campaign, he had actually gotten $2 billion worth. If you had gone out to buy it as advertising, he would have had to pay $2 billion, which would have cut into his bank account considerably.
Yes.
So anyway, I actually wrote a column blaming Jeff Zucker, who is he's not the only one, but Jeff Zucker, who was at NBC during the time that The Apprentice and Celebrity Apprentice was on the air, he realized that Donald Trump was, as Trump himself has said, a ratings machine. People like to watch him on TV. It's just a fact. He's very, very skilled at kind of compelling your attention, being captivating in that way. And so he drove ratings at NBC, and when Zucker went from NBC to CNN, he knew that Trump could do that for him, and he did do it. CNN's ratings and the other cable networks, which had been in trouble to some extent, not across the board, but have had a fabulous year. They've been very, very, very profitable, and they've had some of the best ratings they've ever had. Right. So, and I don't mean to make this all one thing, but that certainly was a way that Trump got a lot of exposure that he would have certainly wanted to have. Right. But, it's not all about that. It's obviously his message resonated deeply with people all over the country who were feeling like their lives were not so good. And when he talked about illegal immigrants and when he talked about trade and the failing factories, it really grabbed people.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about what the White House will look like after inauguration in terms of press relations, but talk to us a little bit about just the last couple days. He obviously gave us a somewhat gracious speech on election night, or I should say the next morning, but tell us what you think of the first few days as the president-elect.
In terms of, I mean, if you're just looking at it through the lens that I am looking at it through, at least for the purposes of today, which is, you know, what will the relationship be between the new president and the press, which I think is very important. The signs are not very good. He immediately went against traditional protocol and didn't have the press with him on his first official trip to the White House. That doesn't bode well for access. He, you know, some of the people that are on his transition team or who are being talked about for positions are not by any means friends of the press. His closeness to people like Steve Bannon, who was his campaign CEO, I guess, or chairman, who is the head of, or has been, I guess still is, on leave from Breitbart News, which is an alt-right news outlet, you know, and who's, you know, is for me, a very troubling figure. All of these things are something to be quite concerned about from my point of view.
Right, and I guess that kind of leads into my next question in terms of looking ahead. Of course, it's hard to predict anything these days, I would say, but what's it going to look like? What the press relations in the Donald Trump administration? What are those press briefings going to look like?
I mean, I don't think that he's going to be. I think he'll be accessible in some ways, but I don't think he'll be. I don't think he will make it easy to ask him questions at press briefings where he's going to be able to be held accountable in a way we honestly haven't seen too much of it anyway. You know, President Obama has not been an accessible president to the press. In fact, it's been, I think it's 7 years. I'm, you know, don't tweet me. Yeah. But it's been a long time since Trump has had a real sit down with the Washington Post, and you know, he hasn't been particularly accessible to the press either. But I don't think Trump will be. And also, he has talked about his aversion to the current protections for the press in the form of libel laws. So he's talked over and over again about wanting to change, or as he puts it, loosen up the libel laws so that people can sue the press more easily and win big awards. So these are protections that I believe are really important so that the press can do its job.
Right.
And you know, it's always, I try to say this because I really believe it, that when reporters and editors and news organizations are doing their jobs and doing them well, they're actually doing them on behalf of citizens. They're not doing them, I hope, to win awards or get people in their newsrooms to pat them on the back, but they are actually functioning as a representative of the public. At their best, they're doing that.
Right. We're going to get to questions in just a moment. We have two staffers on either side of the room. If you guys could raise your hands. They have mics, so they'll, just so I can hear you, and we are recording this for a later broadcast. They'll hand the mic to you. Curious if you had any personal experiences dealing with the Trump while he was a candidate, his press people, and what how that went.
Well, not with him directly, although I was at both conventions in Cleveland and Philadelphia, so I got a feel for it, I guess, in that way. And I have talked to both Jason Miller and Hope Hicks, two of his spokespeople. So, you know, and I haven't found them to be particularly accessible again, but they don't probably have much reason to like me all that well anyway.
Right,
so
right.
It may be somewhat understandable.
Right. Do you want to start off? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you for coming today. This question goes back to your comments about cable news. With cable news being driven by ratings and viewers, and people generally being more attracted to scandal and characters versus nuances and policy, is this inevitable? Is it in 4 years from now, are we going to see the same type of attention to character versus actual policies?
Right. Great question, and a continuing question. I mean, this doesn't speak directly to cable news, but I saw someone counted up the number of minutes that network nightly news had given to issues over the course of the campaign, and it was some ridiculously small number, like 32 minutes. In general, journalists can be faulted for not paying enough attention to issues and for paying too much attention to the horse race over the course of a campaign. Cable news is terrible about that, Can we expect any better of them? I mean, I guess I'm idealistic enough to think that while these outlets, MSNBC, CNN, they are private business, they are businesses. They do have shareholders. They have to make money. But I also think that they should, and in some cases do, acknowledge that they also are public trusts. And it would be good to see them acting more like that and less like they're all about profit.
Before we get to this gentleman's question, and then we'll go over there, I want to ask you, do you think there will be any type of, maybe looking into, and I hate to say 2020, let's not think about that yet, but do you think there may be more shifting of resources from news organizations? Like you mentioned, they did visit Ohio and Michigan and whatnot, but will there be more? I mean, obviously,
well, in the past couple days, I've heard both the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, and Marty Barron from the Washington Post. And by the way, I have to interject that both of those papers did some amazing investigative work during this campaign. And at my paper, a guy named David Fahrenthold did incredible investigative work into Donald Trump's claims of charitable giving, which turned out to be pretty much false. Really dug into it in a great way and followed the money.
Yeah, I was asking about resources, in terms of...
Yeah, I would be very hesitant. So both of those top editors have said they wish that they had, while they did do those stories, they wish that they had put more people in the field to be in those crucial areas and to give us a better report from there. I'm very worried about the financial future of our news institutions. Some of the most important ones, like those and others. The bottom is falling out of print advertising, which is the way these news organizations still support themselves for the most part. Regional papers are in real trouble. It's going to be very ugly. And so I am very hesitant to say what 2020 or 2019 is going to look like, because I'm very fearful of what it's going to look like. And I think the combination of the threats that I'm talking about, along with the financial collapse of these news organizations, is very worrisome indeed.
Go ahead, sir.
The other night, I was, speaking of cable news, I was listening to Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, and he gave what I thought was a great report on the Electoral College, which meets on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December. And he insinuated that there's a Hail Mary chance that because Hillary got the popular vote, that they would vote for her instead of Trump.
Right.
Do you think that's fueling all these protests, the fact that they think there's one last hope?
Well, I think the reason for the protests is varied. I think a lot of people are wanting to express their indignation and unhappiness at how things turned out. Someone said, I've heard this a couple times, that they wish that they could find out just how many of those protesters actually went to the polls. And I think that's a great question. But then again, I don't know that I would trust the... It's tough.
Yeah.
I've heard this too, that the electors could change their minds. I think that's grasping at straws. I don't think it's going to happen, although I've heard a little bit about it. It's really not the way things are supposed to work. I mean, if we want to change the electoral, the popular, make the popular vote the thing, one person, one vote, then I think that makes sense. I mean, look, as we found out on Tuesday night, anything can happen. So that could happen. I would be surprised, but then again, I was surprised on Tuesday night, so who the heck knows?
We'll go up there, and then we'll go over there.
Hi, in full disclosure, I asked this question as a newspaper editor, just so you know where my bias is coming from.
Okay.
But in addition to the attempts to delegitimize traditional media in this campaign, we've also seen through Facebook and other social media sites the rise of widespread dissemination of fake or highly partisan takes on news. What impact do you think that had on the election, and what as a society do we need to be doing moving forward with media literacy and approaches like that to try to at least educate the population on what constitutes legitimate news?
Right. Well, you know, you really have gone to the heart of it with that question, and I do think that these fake news sites and the hoaxes which were perpetuated and passed around on Facebook did have an effect. You know, how well informed are we? Not as a general public, not very well, and it's getting worse. We're in a different era now. We don't have, Walter Cronkite, and I think that Facebook has a role in this, and they need to get serious about figuring out how to tell people what's true and what's not true, and not to simply perpetuate all this complete nonsense. I mean, BuzzFeed did this story about this group of young people in Macedonia who are just setting up fake news sites, and they're being disseminated as if it were, the Columbus Dispatch. It is really terrible. So I think that that's a real issue, and I think as legitimate, responsible news organizations struggle, and there's more and more of this fake stuff, I think that's a big problem, and I'd like to see Facebook face up to the fact that they're not just a tech company, as they insist, or a platform for communicating and passing around baby pictures, but actually a place that it has become the leading distributor of news and a huge factor in the way our society functions. But they give lip service to that, but they just don't want to see themselves as a media company, but they are, and I think they could use some editors.
Interesting. Yes.
How do you think that the election would have gone if Bernie was the Democratic candidate?
Good question.
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about that. I think that he would, I mean, look, my gut feeling is that he would have struggled in the general election because there are two things going on. There's a sort of a tension here. On the one hand, he was able to draw these big crowds, and people felt passionate and they felt represented by Bernie. We have to call him Bernie, right? Doesn't have a last name. There's that. However, the fact that he was a socialist and that he was pretty far off to the left could have hurt him in the general election. So I think he would have addressed the sort of the passion gap that Hillary Clinton came up against. The people, they might have said to themselves, well, maybe she's the lesser of two evils, but I'm not going to, and maybe I'll vote for her, but I'm not going to gather up all my friends and get out there and, bring people with me and let's make it happen. I think he could have done more of that, but I think that, sort of his downside was that he was pretty far outside the mainstream. And in general election, I think Trump, for one thing, could have made a lot of that and found his weak spots. So I know a lot of people think that he could have beaten Trump. I'm not so sure about that. I think possibly Joe Biden could have, but Joe Biden decided that he didn't want to do that. So I can't give you 100% on that.
Next question. There you go.
I often wondered, papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, people generally think of them as liberal media. And so you would see these great reports like you mentioned, but I kept thinking they're talking to the wrong audience. That New York Times said, give us one more chance to tell you why Donald Trump's the wrong candidate, but then everyone voting for Donald Trump would ignore it because it's the New York Times. How do you get around that?
Right, you know, that's right. There's a lot of preaching to the choir. And I really also wonder whether, you know, the voters who ended up really swaying this election, was that their chief source of news? You know, I don't think so. But, you know, I do think about some of these prediction efforts that were made that showed the probability of a Hillary Clinton win, you know, for example, the New York Times has this upshot thing called the election predictor or something, I don't know, it has a name, I can't remember, election forecast, that, you know, pretty much throughout the last few weeks and months was, you know, showing that, according to them, you know, Hillary Clinton had a 85% chance, 90% chance of winning the election. And I think that probably played into some of the sense that, well, you know, she doesn't really need me. She doesn't need my vote. She doesn't need my community. She doesn't need my union, whatever it is. She's going to win anyway. So maybe I'll stay home. I mean, but I do agree that, you know, were the people who were really, you know, in the heartland and going to sway this election one way or the other, were they relying on the New York Times as their chief news site? And were they going to be swayed by whether the Times said he's lying or not lying? You know, no, I don't think so.
We'll go over there and then there.
This election kind of showed that the Democratic Party was a bit out of touch with one of the largest voting bases in America. I kind of have two parts to this question. First, how does the Democratic Party redefine itself for 2020? And then second, does the Republican Party now embrace itself as an anti-establishment party, or does it distance itself from Trump and try and maintain the identity it has?
Well, the Democratic Party, you know, I mean, I have to say up front that I'm not a political expert, and so I probably know as much as you do about this. Maybe a little more. I am forced to read a lot and to talk to people a lot about it. But, I mean, I think Bernie Sanders had an op-ed in today's New York Times that's worth reading. He talked about how, you know, Democrats need to come together and figure out a new way of going forward and sort of pick themselves up and dust themselves off and get back to their core values and their core constituencies. You know, I can't forecast at all what's going to happen on the Republican side of things. I mean, they've got both houses of Congress and the White House at this point, and there are going to be appointments to the Supreme Court, one immediately, and, you know, there's a couple others that are likely to come up. That's a lot of concentration of power in one party, and the checks and balances that are the basis of our democracy are, again, really threatened here. So I think there's some tough questions.
Before I get to your question, I just want to pivot off his question. Obviously, he's asking about soul searching in the Democratic Party and Republican Party, in a sense. Has the soul searching begun in the news media?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, there's self-flagellation and beating ourselves up quite a bit.
Right.
I mean, there's also defensiveness, and you know, we're thinking a lot about, you know, kind of how we got it wrong, how we can report better to represent the population. And then there's a certain amount of defensiveness of, well, actually, we didn't get it wrong. You know, we allowed for the possibility, or the 10% possibility that Trump would be elected. Just look at, don't you understand probability? You know, if you were playing Russian roulette, would you really feel comfortable if, you know, you knew there was a 15% chance of the wrong? However Russian roulette works. Anyway, there definitely is a lot of, well, I guess soul searching is the best way to put it. I guess navel gazing might be another.
Right. Go ahead.
So, in a divided country where we have one side that thinks that the mainstream media doesn't connect with their views, has been ridiculing Trump and adding legitimacy to Hillary's campaign, and we have another side that is not accepting a constitutional mandate, who are protesting election results. Do you think the profit-driven mainstream media that caters to elites fuels or adds to the hatred that each side has got for the other and feeds off it?
That is there's a lot there. So are you saying, I mean, what are you asking? Is the mainstream media at fault in this divided?
Oh, he's gonna, yeah.
You know, I guess I'd like to answer your question, but it's so packed with
The question is,
stuff that I'm having trouble.
The question is, I think, the kind of reporting or the kind of views that mainstream media pursues. I think both sides have their hatred increased or of the other side, because one side thinks that they're not reflecting my views.
Well represented. Mhm.
Yes, and the other side increasingly thinks they're too elite and who don't respect the other side. So
Right.
do you think that the media adds to it and also feeds off the hatred?
Are they exploiting, maybe, perhaps?
Yeah,
word?
I mean, it is true that both sides of this divided country are, you know, that there's a media issue with each of them, and you have described it well. I mean, you know, I guess I want to be positive and look for how do we go forward and what's the best answer to all of this, and what's a way out of the problem that you've described. And I think that it is for the best news organizations to do their jobs really well. And it's not about ridiculing a candidate, and it's not about being, you know, on the one hand, it's not about being stuck in our bubbles on the other hand. It's about understanding the electorate. It's about doing deep digging, real stories. And a lot of that was done. I mean, this is the part that's very discouraging for me. All of that good journalism that was done didn't seem to resonate nearly as much as some of the things that came up on these fake websites or the chanting of "lock her up" that happened at rallies. So, you know, I'm a true believer. I think journalism is really important, and I continue to think that. But it's a little discouraging to be in this place right now, especially since Trump has fanned these flames that say those people are against you. I don't think that most reporters and editors around the country, serious good ones, I don't think they are against. Far from it. They actually do have their hearts in the right place. So I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't think I've addressed your question very directly, but those are sort of some thoughts.
The election was obviously major international news, obviously biggest in the US, but around the world it was major news and reported extensively. The Toronto Star, for example, Daniel Dale, their
Yes.
Washington correspondent, kept a daily tally, let's say, of the inaccurate things Trump said during the campaign, and there's an article published every day keeping track. So my question is, what are your thoughts overall on the general reporting by the international press or international media coverage of the US election?
Right. Well, I would say that the international press, particularly the European press, was paying a lot of attention to this because they're seeing very similar movements in their own countries. And, you know, we've all understand in this room, I'm sure, that Brexit and the Trump movement have been compared to each other, and France has a somewhat similar situation. I think there's been a lot of attention to it, and whether other countries will take any lessons from what's happened here, I can't say, but I think there's been a very high level of interest. I've done some stuff with German reporters. I watch the Guardian quite carefully. I'm very interested in them, and they've paid very close attention to it and done a really good job, I think, perhaps with a little bit more distance, and I think the BBC as well. I think they have documented it well. I don't think they have the power to influence it very much.
You guys are making my job much easier, all these great questions.
These
we'll
are
go to
great.
the third row there, and then Gail in the first row will have a question.
You'll hear from my accent, I'm a Brit, so my question actually is a Brexit question, because I was very taken with what you said at the beginning, which is that the media missed the story. On the first night, you said the media missed the story. Now, I live in London, but I work for an organisation that's DC-based, and I'm frequently here. And I was here in July, and my American colleagues looked at me and said, what were you thinking, allowing that to happen? And I said back to them, but you need to be careful. The unthinkable happened in my country, and it could happen in your country too. So my question to you is, why did, or did the US media look across to the UK and Europe and think, actually, the left behind communities, the vote against elitism, the vote against politicians was exactly what happened there. And to me, it feels like this is part of the same momentum.
Right.
So did nobody think, missing the story when the same story was unfolding across the ocean?
These are all such good questions, and that's a very good one. I do think there were many stories, many reports that compared the two. There was a lot of, these are similar things. Some people think this could happen here. I think that, I want to make 2 points. One is, while the media did not, most people who were exposed to the media thought that Clinton was going to win. So in that sense, I think the media missed the story. But it wasn't as if there was no attention paid to this. I think there was. It just wasn't taken seriously enough. And my other kind of theory with this is that we were having our own, the Joan Didion book title, The Year of Magical Thinking. I think the media was having its own year of magical thinking. That somehow, because of Trump's offensive remarks and the outrageous things that happened during the campaign, I think that many members of the media thought, well, yes, Brexit, and yes, he's popular, and yeah, there's a lot of people at his rallies, but certainly someone who has said these things and done these things and had the background that he had, that person can't be the president. And so because, I have no proof of this, this is purely my theory, that because it was unthinkable, therefore it couldn't happen. And so I think that was a part of it. And our being, somewhat sequestered, more journalists live in New York and DC and on the West Coast now than ever before, because the regional media have been weakened. And so all of these factors, I think, played into what happened.
We'll go to that side.
So Tom Frank wrote a piece in Harper's where he was very critical of the media and their approach to Bernie, suggesting that they had squelched him, and actually especially critical of the Washington Post. And I wonder if you want to respond to that critique and/or to the claim that the media took neither Bernie nor Trump seriously, but they gave Trump all this oxygen and they suffocated Bernie.
Yeah, as John said, I have actually only been at the Washington Post since May, and up until April, I was at the New York Times, and I actually wrote a couple pieces as public editor, and the public editor is kind of the internal watchdog at the Times. And I got many, many, many complaints from Times readers saying, we love Bernie and you're ignoring him or you're disparaging him. And I did write a couple columns that said that the Times wasn't taking his candidacy seriously enough. And when they did write about him, they did often with a dismissive tone. So I think there is some truth to that. I was watching the Times much more carefully at that time than I was the Washington Post, so I think I can speak to that a little better. I mean, I also did just some numbers counts. The Times, from the beginning was I don't want to say behind Hillary Clinton, but was paying tremendous attention to her candidacy. They assigned a reporter to her. They assigned a person to do nothing but write about, well, they said the Clintons, but it was really about Hillary Clinton in 2013, So how could somebody have a chance against that? And then you're right, when Trump came along, it was a different kind of coverage, but I agree that neither of them was taken seriously, although in different ways.
We have time for just a few more questions. We'll go back there, and then Gail, Gail, in the front row too. Just bring the mic up after that. But go ahead.
Hi. So I wanted to ask a question kind of about a phenomenon that we see at work, at least for me. We see high-frequency trading really frequently where I work, and it's become a serious problem. And it seems that over the last 10, 15 years that this whole concept of like high-frequency news has become a very big problem too. Every news agency wants to be at the front lines within a millisecond of news coming out. You know, the bombings happened in Chelsea. You'd see reports on every news site ripped off of Reddit within 2 minutes. And that's really important. But then news sites have to fill the empty space.
Right.
And so during election night, you'd see CNN, for example, publishing every time a 0.2% change happened in the polls. I guess my question is, how do I, as a news reader, and not waste my time watching CNN for 2 hours or reading 3 hours of New York Times every day to figure out the little tidbits of actual news going on? And then how do news agencies look to address that over the next 5, 10, 20 years?
Right. Well, there is a real issue of, you know, competition, wanting to be first, and there's always been in journalism, you know, do you want to be first or do you want to be right? So there's always been that tension. It's much greater now because of the internet and the way news is disseminated. I think as a news consumer, you can do a couple of things. You can find a couple of news organizations or outlets that you, through your own, you know, judgment, find to be trustworthy and generally trustworthy and good, and have a few, you know, 3 of them, let's say, and you kind of use them and compare them to each other and read within them, and don't waste your time with the ones that are just nonsense. So I think picking and applying your own critical thinking to, does this story, you know, I mean, I see things come across my Facebook feed or in the trending topics all the time, and I think, what? Could that be true? And so, you know, how do you decide whether it's true? Well, you go back to some organizations that you know are rigorous in their reporting generally, and you compare and contrast a little bit. I mean, we have to be better news consumers. And I also feel so strongly that we need to teach this in schools, that we need to teach kids how to consume news, and it's called news literacy. And there are people and organizations working on it, and I think, you know, we've just had a huge wake-up call about how important that is. So, you know, I think not wasting your time and picking well and applying your own critical judgment to it, and also knowing for sure that in the initial phases of a breaking news story, there's going to be a lot of misinformation out there. It's inevitable. So you can't really believe it and take it to the bank, and you need to kind of say, well, I'm going to watch this and see what they're saying. You know, oftentimes a report will come out and it'll quickly get debunked. So it's important to sort of stay with it a little bit as it's happening.
I'm glad you mentioned news literacy, because our Newseum education team does that every day with classrooms. So
Yeah.
we're going to go right there, and then we have a question in the front row, if you can bring the mic after that, but you go ahead.
So Donald Trump's margin of victory in many of the battleground states was fairly narrow. And about 10 days before the election, the FBI director did something rather unprecedented with his letter to Congress concerning Hillary Clinton's emails. And of course, shortly before the election, he walked that back. What role do you think that unusual event may have played in the final outcome?
I think it played a big role. I really do. You know, again, it's hard to judge because you have to sort of suspend disbelief in the polls, which didn't serve us all that well. But her strength was much greater. She was definitely knocked back by the events of, what's today, Saturday? Just 2 weeks ago, you know, 2 weeks and 1 day. Amazing. I don't think she recovered from that. And I think for people who were saying, well, yeah, I guess she's the better choice, the safer choice. This whole thing had happened with Trump and the women, and maybe they were drifting over more to Hillary as a safer, better choice. I think this knocked that back in an important and serious way. And his, as you put it so well, his walk back of it a few days later really only served to keep the whole subject in front of people's eyes. It may have been, I don't necessarily question his intentions. They may have been okay. You know, maybe he felt he had to be transparent, and then having done it and gathered so much criticism, maybe he felt he had to do the next thing. I'm not in his head, but I do think it made a real impact, yes.
I think we're going to have to make these two the last, unfortunately, because of time. So why don't you go ahead and then we'll get...
So I'm a freshman college student at GW studying political communication right now. And so since my 4 years are going to be the same 4 years as Trump, and if the White House starts to take on some like the reality TV aspects that the campaign did, I'm curious about how you think I can avoid like developing cynicism about everything that is political communication.
I mean, well, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, and it's going to be a very interesting time. I mean, to me, okay, I think you have to balance a few things. I would try to stay as well informed as possible, and I would try to do something that is helpful and good for the causes or the beliefs that you buy into. You know, that could be different for all of us. For me, it's trying to write things that are meaningful. You know, for others in this room, it may be getting involved with causes or politics or something else. I mean, I think we need to look the situation in the eye and know what it is. And I also think we have to be optimistic and ready to, you know, try to create change. So I would do that. Does that make sense to you? I mean, I don't know. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I think that I think if you remain open and aware and conscious of what you might be able to do in your life to make the nation better. And maybe that's being a reporter, or maybe it's becoming a part of an organization or something, or helping with news literacy or something else. I think it's important to do positive things.
We'll make this the last question.
Yeah, thanks. David Brooks ended his column in yesterday's Times with the following, that within a year, Trump is either going to resign or be impeached. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, yes, that is very interesting, and he's not the only one saying that. You know, there's this, we were talking about this. There's one of the only two really prominent people I can think of who predicted that Trump would win were, yes, Michael Moore, the filmmaker, who just nailed it, you know, and Alan Lichtman, who's a professor at American University, who has this sort of these criteria. And Alan Lichtman today or yesterday, I can't remember, is also predicting that Trump won't make it through. And now he's not basing that on any criteria or any science of any kind. It's just his gut feeling. So I don't know if we can really buy into it as much as his other thing. I think that Trump has a lot of built-in conflicts of interest. And if you look at his past, I mean, if you read this book that the two great Washington Post journalists did about Trump called Trump Revealed, I mean, there's a lot that would suggest that some troubling things could happen. It's not beyond comprehension that something will come to pass. But I also think that there's a little bit of magical thinking in that as well. Oh, don't worry, he's not going to really last. So he won't last long enough to appoint many people to the Supreme Court. Don't worry, he'll be impeached or resigned by then. I wouldn't be so sure.
I'm sorry, I don't want to go over time, but is there any credence to the fact that he probably didn't even want to be president? He just wanted exposure, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I did think that along the way, but it seems that, and you know, a lot of people said, oh, he'll drop out, he really doesn't want this. Well, you know, it didn't work out that way. So I think it's important to look at the reality of it. He is going to be the president. He is going to be the president for 4 years. It's, you know, there's not going to be the Hail Mary or the impeachment or the electors doing something they're not supposed to do. I doubt it. You know, I guess anything can happen. But I think we have to sort of deal with the fact that it's President Trump.
I'll end it with just, could you give us a little preview? We talked about it a little bit before about your next column, because it deals with the First Amendment.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to have kind of clear messages. So I've had a couple columns in the past couple days. One that said the media blew it, and one that was a journalistic call to arms. We have to do our jobs better than ever before. And now, my next column is basically going to say that there are real threats to our First Amendment protections coming up, and that what really, talk about make America great again or make America great. A lot of what makes America great is that we protect free speech and free expression, and we do that because we have the First Amendment. It makes us rare in this world, and we need to, as a country, be aware of how lucky we are and find ways to make sure that that doesn't get torn down or eaten into, and find ways to protect it.
Right. So please read that column, and why not even buy a copy of the paper on Monday
There
morning.
you go.
I want to thank Margaret Sullivan, media columnist for the Washington Post, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. Thank you.